If you like my content, please consider supporting me on my Patreon or on my Buy Me a Coffee page. The links are in the description of the video. Thank you very much. I was especially looking forward to making this video, since American demographics are absolutely fascinating to me, as is America itself. It is this vast, geographically diverse continent of a country that many different old world ethnicities settled in, and it created a fusion of the old European identities with the newly colonized environment, which is fascinating to me and many other Europeans in the familiarity and simultaneous foreignness of the Americans. Hinek Kmoníček, a seasoned Czech diplomat who was the ambassador of the Czech Republic in the United States, Australia, the United Nations, India, and is currently our ambassador to Vietnam, once said that while white Americans look basically indistinguishable from Europeans, which creates the illusion of them being also very similar in their culture and nature, after getting to truly know the people and their mentality, the cultural differences are as significant as between Europeans and the Asian nations he managed to live in. While that might seem like hyperbole, it is indubitably true that the cultural differences are as wide as the Atlantic Ocean, and they are getting wider with time, both due to the lowering share of people of European descent in America and also the passage of time causing the two continents to continue to naturally drift apart due to their respective internal developments. Before we get into this video, I would like to address some potential concerns that might arise. After my deep dive into the demographics of the Russian Federation, many people accused me of being anti-Russian, which is typical for post-communist Central and Eastern European nations that do not know any better than to be American lapdogs. Likely, such voices would again appear in reaction to this video, after people might conclude that I did not look at America through the same lenses as when analyzing Russia. It is, to a certain extent, true. The opinions and views of basically every person are rooted in their values, personal experience, and cultural background. As a person from post-communist Central Europe, I cannot separate my worldviews from the historical experience of my nation with the two discussed countries. For Central Europeans, the United States are connected with the American involvement in the First World War and its aftermaths, when the support of President Woodrow Wilson significantly enabled the creation of independent nation-states in the region for the first time in centuries, which carries enormous sentimental historical value for the mentioned peoples. It is then connected to the significant involvement of America in the Second World War, which, once again, helped to preserve our nation's survival in the face of the cultural and physical extermination by the Nazis. After that, there was the determined American opposition to the Soviet Union in the Cold War that contributed to the final dissolution of the Soviet Empire and our reintegration with the Western economic and political structures, which brought massive economic benefits as well as significant expansion of the national and individual freedoms. The influence of America on the region is just a clear net positive. Russia, after the liberation from Nazis, for which the fallen Soviet soldiers deserve our respect, on the other hand, either imposed, as in the case of Poland or Hungary, or was vital in maintaining, as in the case of Czechoslovakia, of totalitarian communist regimes which were satellites of the Soviet Union. These regimes suppressed the freedoms and rights of the citizens and caused a very sharp economic decline. In the case of Poland or the Baltic nations, the historical wrongdoings go even deeper into history. I cannot disregard this historical memory. When I try to evaluate different countries, I do not put up a whiteboard and try to make an objective list of the pros and cons of their respective impacts on the world as a whole. I do not let this cultural baggage impact my demographic analysis of the individual nations, but it definitely might shine through my words when I speak about the countries. So, if someone accuses me of being visibly more pro-American than pro-Russian, then yes, I guess it is true. But I completely understand if someone from the Middle East or Latin America sees the world differently due to their historical experience with the Americans. That is natural. People are emotional creatures. It would be the same if a Czech discussed the legacy of Winston Churchill with an Indian person. While for the Czech, he would be the etalon of heroic Western statesman standing in fierce opposition to Adolf Hitler. To the Indian, he might be a racist, oppressive representative of the colonial overlords. I would, of course, not get into such debates, since my inner Indian identity, manifesting in my running joke of an accent, might kick in, and I would hurry to tear down the local statue of Churchill. But back to American demographics. Since it is a very rich topic, I decided to make this a two-part video series. In the first part, I will analyze the anthropological characteristics that are defining and influencing American demographics and the historical overview of the American demographic structure. In the second part of the video series, I will get into the juicy subjects of race, ethnicity, immigration, and the negative influences that the possible loosening of the monogamous nature of American society might have on birth rates and the society as a whole. The next part should come out within a week. So if you feel like some of these important topics are missing in this video, just stay tuned, it will come. The renowned French anthropologist Emmanuel Todd is famous for his theory of different historical family systems hugely influencing different people's contemporary political, ideological, and economic success and behavior. As for the Americans, he puts them in the unegalitarian nuclear family type, a relatively rare family type common for the Anglosphere, except Ireland, and partially also the Netherlands, Norway, and Denmark. That means that people tend to move away from their parents relatively soon and continue to live alone and support themselves economically instead of sharing a household with their elders and siblings. The unegalitarian part means there are no prescribed rules on how the inheritance should be divided between the siblings. These two factors make people from this historical family type prone to very pronounced individualism, since it is normal to go and make it in the world as an individual freed from the nurture and the authority of the father. High threshold of tolerance of economic inequality within the society, since the siblings are not used to splitting their inheritance equally, and very hostile attitude towards authoritarianism, since the authority of the father within the household is not as significant and persistent as in different family models. Countries with the unegalitarian nuclear family model are thus the most anthropologically equipped for democracy, free markets, and overall social liberalism. They are also capable to better integrate the modern wave of female emancipation, since the more equal, for the standards of the times of course, position of women goes back for centuries in these countries. There are also very low, almost non-existent, levels of cousin marriages, which points to the low influence of the extended families and clans prevalent, for example, in the Muslim world, which further increases individualism. Emmanuel Todd then points out several key characteristics differentiating Americans from Europeans: lack of extensive social safety nets and more decentralized federal nature of the system with less vertical and more horizontal power structures. High geographic mobility of Americans within the country, moving from state to state at rates unimaginable in Europe. Not just between European states, but also within them. This geographic mobility manifests itself in the very high inner demographic dynamism of the United States. When things start to get worse somewhere, due to crime, regulation, or an economic slowdown, people just get up and move elsewhere. The old northeastern metropolitan core, including New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, or Boston, has been losing importance for at least 70 years. The most dynamic regions seemed to be California and the West Coast, but that is also likely over now, and the southern Sunbelt and the West, without the coasts, look like they are going to be the places where things are happening now. In 1950, Los Angeles was the only one of the 10 most populous cities located outside the country's northeastern quadrant. In 2020, it was one of the 3 California cities on the list, along with San Diego and San Jose. Texas also had 3: Houston, San Antonio, and Dallas. Phoenix, Arizona, was the 5th most populous city in 2020. New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia are the only northeastern cities that made both the 1950 and 2020 top 10 lists. This process was significantly helped by the synergy of developing a dense highway network in the US and the spread of air conditioning as a standard part of homes, offices, and cars, which turned awfully hot and distant places like Arizona into booming regions. When I spent a couple of days in Los Angeles in 2019, I was shocked at how run down the place felt. I have rarely felt as unsafe as when walking through downtown LA on Sunday morning. Since the offices in the skyscrapers were all empty, the only people there were hobos and junkies. I could not wait to rent a car and get out of there. In Europe, the ties of people to their hometowns and regions are much deeper. Another aspect differentiating Americans from Europeans is higher religiosity expressed through an atomized, decentralized religious structure consisting of tens of different denominations instead of one or a couple of large denominations concentrating vast majority of the population prevalent in Europe, as well as the imperfect monopoly of the state on legitimate violence, manifesting in persistently higher homicide rates in the United States in comparison with Europe. While in Europe, the homicide rate per 100,000 people plummeted from very high medieval rates to rates below one homicide per 100,000 people at the beginning of the 20th century, they remain between 5 to 10 times higher in the United States. It was common for men to carry knives at them at all times in medieval Europe, while Americans today put significant value on the right to carry firearms. According to Emmanuel Todd, these characteristics make Americans the closest to the original primordial Homo sapiens natural state. Hunters and gatherers were also highly mobile, lacked the centralized vertical power structures with the prevalence of more horizontal structures based on the decentralized tribal nature of the society, adhered to many different religious beliefs, and women also had a relatively strong position within the tribal groups, even though there was a clear separation of roles based on the physical differences between the sexes. According to Todd's research, most people have lived in relationships close to monogamist nuclear families within the primordial tribes, even though polygamy was practiced to a certain extent. And violence was, of course, also an essential characteristic of the tribal Homo sapiens of the past. This anachronistic similarity of Americans to the original Homo sapiens is the key to the incredible success of the Homo Americanus in modern history. The deep contradiction in our perception of the different family systems is that the one that we perceive as the most modern, which is the nuclear family model associated with the modern industrial way of life and the most developed nations in the world, is actually the most primitive and anachronistic one from the anthropological point of view. While the nuclear family was prevalent in prehistoric times, the more complex family models began to develop with the agricultural revolution, which made people sedentary and thus created the need to develop inheritance rules to pass on the accumulated belongings. Hunters and gatherers moving from one place to another their whole lives did not accumulate any important belongings, since they really owned only the things they could carry with them in their hands. The nuclear family model was preserved on the outskirts of the ancient world, on the British Isles, precisely because they were a complete backwater for most of the ancient times, and the sophisticated family systems aimed at preserving wealth within the family reached them relatively late. From the British Isles, it was then transplanted into America and other settler societies like Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. But the cultural specifics are most distinct in America, since America began to develop its own identity much sooner than other settler societies that remained much more English in their culture. This contradiction is in the heart of America. Its simultaneous progressivism, modernity, and high levels of technological innovation, in combination with the primordial characteristics typical for pre-agricultural societies, which is the genius of Homo Americanus. Americans, and to a certain extent the rest of the Anglosphere, have thus been the most capable of tapping into the natural human dynamism and the capacity to innovate and adapt to the conditions, since they were least restricted by the layers of dense family structures. In Todd's view, this largely explains the incredible success of Britain and the settler societies stemming from British ethnicity in the last 200 years, manifesting among other things in their demographic success. In the 11th century, England was a periphery with 1/4 of the population of France. Today, the Anglo-American world has a population of 150 million, soon to be much higher than that of the European Union. It is likely that America itself will overtake the EU in population in this century. While I cannot really vouch for the correctness of the anthropological data that Emmanuel Todd presents, this interpretation intrigues me, since it explains much of the contradictory European approach towards America. Europeans are simultaneously fascinated with America, its culture and culture wars, politics and internal problems, while, at the same time, belittling Americans and constantly trying to prove their ultimate superiority in how the public things are run in Europe. How it is possible that America can constantly come out on top, even though I subconsciously feel we are doing things better, more rationally, effectively, and are ultimately more civilized. Lack of public healthcare and social safety nets, violent crime, tribalism, alleged bigotry stemming from irrational religiosity of the people, and the fierce opposition to the statist solutions that have long ago prevailed in Europe, are seemingly contradictory to the demographic, economic, and geopolitical success of the American project. But the reasons for this seemingly irrational American characteristic might actually be among the roots of its success. I often personally experience this precise dilemma. When watching some American TV show full of violence, crime, rednecks on meth in some southern US state, tense racial relations, and hard-ass detectives chasing bad guys, I usually watch it while simultaneously thinking, well, I'm sure glad I live somewhere else, where this stuff is not happening. But on some subconscious level, it is also cool as hell, and I kind of little bit wish I lived there, if it makes any sense. I understand that TV shows are not reality, but a highly dramatized and romanticized version of it. And I am not trying to glorify pathological behavior that negatively influences human lives. But in Europe, the state has mostly monopolized legitimate violence for centuries. Heroic masculine characters in Europe are largely confined to soldiers fighting and dying for their countries against the army of another state. There is something undeniably captivating about the persistence of violence outside this framework of state control, especially in an otherwise completely developed and wealthy society. The strange combination of fascination and contempt characterizes the European attitude toward America. We feel more civilized, but we cannot turn our eyes away from the alleged barbarism on our screens, as if we were almost too civilized for our own good and have lost something on the way. I hope this is understandable, since I am trying to describe what is more like a feeling or an emotion, but I think more people will understand what I am talking about. Let me know in the comments if you sometimes feel the same. Anyway, I think Emmanuel Todd's observations are highly valuable if you are interested in demographics and anthropology. I cannot recommend his books enough, even if I do not share all his views. From the beginning of the colonization of the Northern American continent, the ethnic base of the newly emerging American nation was British and, most precisely, English, especially its elites. But because of the War of Independence against Britain made it politically problematic to identify as English, the term Anglo-Saxon became the most used way to describe the ethnic core of the newly emerging nation. For a long time, the American elite was mostly contained to fit the acronym WASP, White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, even though it was a merger of many distinct cultural groups originating from different parts and social classes of the British Isles. Of course, it is essential that from very early on, even before many of the British colonizers arrived, millions of enslaved people from Africa were imported and became a crucial part of the American DNA, which I will come to in the second part of this series. While the massive population growth of the United States in the 18th and early 19th centuries was supported both by immigration from other parts of Europe, mostly Germany and Scandinavia, it was mostly the synergy of the high growth phase of the demographic transition happening in Britain, creating large population surplus to be exported overseas, and the very high birth rates, around 7 children per woman, of Americans themselves. As America expanded westward throughout the vast continent, the lands full of fertile soil open for colonization enabled many people to become self-sufficient farmers, living far from the demographic and political East Coast heartlands. This libertarian streak is still very present in American political conservatism and stands in contrast to European conservatism, which is focused more on the keeping of stability of the states precipitated by the power of the governments. However, the Anglo-Saxon demographic tide rolled over the continent and completely steamrolled the previously established French and Spanish colonial settlements that lacked the new supply of settlers and did not stand a chance. During the centuries since the beginning of the colonization, there was also a continuous diminishing of the Native American populations due to the lack of immunity to European diseases, as well as the violent eradication by the settlers and infighting between the Indians themselves. By 1820, the United States had 10 million inhabitants, and that number was growing fast. It reached 23 million in 1850 and 76 million by 1900, clearly outgrowing the population of Britain. In the second half of the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century, a massive immigration wave supported a breakneck pace of population growth. This time, the immigration sources included basically the whole of Europe, which created ethnic tensions that I will come back to in the next part of the series. Between 1820 and 1920, over 8 million people male came from Britain and Ireland, 5 to 6 million from Germany, 4 million from both Italy and Austro-Hungary, 3 million from Russia, mostly Jews, and 2 million from Scandinavia. Massive population growth, combined with the Industrial Revolution during the 19th century, laid ground for the United States to become a superpower that would later overshadow all the European colonial empires, including the British Empire. Following the model of demographic transition, the birth rates in the US fell from the middle of the 19th century and got close to the replacement level in the interwar period. That was accompanied by all the known processes that contribute to the lowering of fertility. For example, significant urbanization. According to the demographic transition, fertility should have stabilized around the replacement level and a large and stable population would emerge out of this process. But after the World War II, something unexpected happened in the developed world and America was at the forefront of this process. Massive baby boom. This period lasted for almost 2 decades and created the largest generation in the history of America. In the late 1950s, the birth rates in the US stood at over 3.5 children per woman, on par with contemporary Pakistan. There are many theories on why it happened. But, as is common for large demographic changes, it was likely a synergy of many cultural and economic influences. Many American men returning from the battlefields of World War II sought the American dream of owning a house where they could raise a family. This wish was met by quite the unique state of the world economy after World War II, in which the United States was the only large industrial economy that the war did not at least partially destroy. Before European economies were rebuilt, the United States industry flourished, supported by massive domestic consumption and skyrocketing exports to the rest of the world. Large variety of home appliances and consumer electronics, like the fridge, washing machines, television, and automobile, became a standard in American and later Western households. Having a large nuclear family became a cultural norm, supported by popular culture and cinema. It is interesting how these post-war decades are, to a certain extent, an idealized reference point for both the conservative right, since it was a time of family values and high church attendance, and the classic economic left, since it was also the golden age of American manufacturing, rising salaries and job security, and overall living standards, when an industrial worker could support a large family with one salary. However idealized some of these conceptions might be, it is true that the 1950s in America were likely one of the best times in history to live, work, and start a family. The population of the United States grew from 100 to 180 million between 1920 and 1960, even though immigration was largely eliminated after the 1920s. But this era of large nuclear families and family-oriented culture sowed the seeds of its later demise. The combination of massive economic prosperity with large young generations growing up in unprecedented material security gave birth to the rise of the phenomenon of teenagers and the emergence of mass youth culture. It gave rise to the 1960s counterculture that combined rebellion against the conservative suburban values of the parents with a consumerist appetite and individualist strive for self-expression. To a certain extent, the counterculture values of the 1960s represent a bedrock from which the modern progressive left of the contemporary age emerged, as I described in my video about the long march through the institutions. Since the baby boomers were such a massive generation, larger than the generations before and after them, they managed to be the predominant voice in American cultural, economic, and political affairs ever since they reached early adulthood. They have accumulated by far the largest amount of wealth in history, constitute a massive voting bloc, and continue to influence the overall cultural climate by pushing their values from the positions of power within politics, media, cultural institutions, and academia. It is a great irony that the condescending saying "okay boomer" is meant to show the out-of-touch approach of the, ideally white, old men to contemporary cultural and political topics. But it was precisely the boomers that are responsible for the massive cultural change to the left that happened throughout the West since the 1960s. As the babies born after the World War started reaching their reproductive age at the end of the 1960s, fertility began to drop. The contraceptive pill became massively available from the 1960s on, and huge hugely contributed to the lowering birth rates, while also definitely breaking the connection between sex and reproduction, which have massive consequences which we are only now beginning to comprehend, since it made sex largely an act of pleasure and disconnected it from the biological consequences in the form of pregnancy. From the 1970s on, American fertility hovered around the replacement level, from the low point of 1.76 children per woman in 1978 to the highest point of 2.1 children per woman in 2007. But it never plunged to the truly low levels under 1.5 children per woman, and, supported by consistently high immigration flows from the 1960s on, the population growth of the United States remains high. There is also very significant fertility diversity across the country, which I will explore in the second part of this series. The United States is in the group of developed Western states that maintain relatively high fertility, and the problem of population aging is not as severe, although it is present. There are many theories on why that is the case, pointing out the higher religiosity of Americans in comparison with most of the Western world, much lower population density allowing massive development of larger family houses in comparison with apartments standard in other developed countries, or the overall geopolitical and economic stability causing optimistic outlooks towards the future that makes having a family less risky. As usual, all of those factors likely play a role, at least partially. Emmanuel Todd, whom I will cite relatively a lot in this series, sees the main reason in the historically deeply rooted higher position of women within the society that makes the combination of family life with career more accessible for women and allows a higher fertility in the age of contemporary female emancipation. I would say that since America was never really affected by major outside conquest or an invasion and enjoys a high level of geographic insulation, there is a sense of optimism and security not felt in the old world, where you are, in the broader historical perspective, always either getting together after the last war with your neighbors or preparing for the next one. America also allows for different highly demographically dynamic religious sects, often living a pre-industrial way of life, such as the Amish or the Mennonites, to thrive. And this sense of possibility of building your own little world according to your beliefs, somewhere in the vast and sparsely populated lands of North America, also adds to the overall feeling of lower state involvement in the affairs of the people. I cannot imagine such sects living in contemporary Europe for many different reasons. Whatever the causes, the fact that the United States is not facing a large population collapse or the crushing aging expected in large parts of the world has great implications for the political order of the 21st century. The fascinating thing is how every major power standing in opposition to the United States is sooner or later caught up by its demographic weakness. While geographic limits in its population growth largely constrained Britain, and the fact that America demographically eclipsed it is logical, the following opponents of America were and are again and again let down by their low fertility. I explored the demographic weakness of the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation in one of my previous videos. China, the current main opponent of the American hegemony, is standing on the brink of a demographic collapse of truly biblical proportions, and it is implausible that it will be able to compete as its population ages and declines by hundreds of millions. And if we look at the countries that are political allies, but also economic competitors, Japan and the European Union are among the oldest societies in the world, which significantly undercuts their economic growth. In the 1980s, there was a real fear that Japan might overtake the United States as the largest economy in the world. Today, after 30 years of a stagnating economy, and with the oldest population in the world, that is unthinkable. I think China will follow a similar route, even though it might not be as peaceful as the decline of Japan. I would say that for many countries, the experience of rapid economic growth, the rise of consumerism, loosening family ties, and cultural westernization had significant negative impacts on fertility, since the respective national cultures cannot cope with the pace of the changes in family patterns. American culture is much better equipped to handle these processes, since they, to a large extent, began in America and grew out of the deeply ingrained anthropological characteristics of Americans that were discussed in the previous chapter. The modern, urban, industrial way of life makes independent nuclear families a standard worldwide, since the more dense family types are suited for agricultural life. But while for most of the planet, the need to adjust to this new way of life means the rupture of the pre-existing cultural patterns with negative impacts on fertility, the Anglophone settler countries were ideally predisposed to thrive in this environment, since it is in sync with their pre-existing cultural norms. Basically, the whole world is trying to adjust to the newly emerging patterns, while for Americans and other Anglophone countries, the disruption is fairly minimal. In a sense, the opponents of America are ramping up their economic output to compete. The westernized socio-economic behavioral models catch on as the countries modernize and liberalize economically and socially, but it simultaneously plants the seed of the future economic demise due to the collapsing and aging populations. It is a vicious cycle. There are potential clouds on the horizon for America. The fertility rate dropped to under 1.7 children per woman for the first time in the last couple of years. And if this fall accelerates in the future, it might threaten the so far sustainable demographic structure of American society. But it might also be just a hiccup, like the 1978 low point. That remains to be seen, even though there are some alarming demographic trends that I will explore in the second part of this video. But suppose the demographic parameters remain relatively stable. In that case, America is projected to have around 400 million inhabitants in 2060, up from circa 330 million today, and 23% of its population older than 65 years in 2060, up from 17% today. It won't be without its problems, but it would be roughly a similar share of retirees as Italy has today, with the significant difference that Italy is just at the beginning of the vast retirement wave and population decline. Stay tuned for the next part.